You're watching Knowledge and Wisdom, where we explore the depths of history, theology, philosophy, archaeology, and beyond. If you're curious to uncover truth and insight across time, this is the place for you. Does the New Testament put onto the lips of Jesus words that he never actually uttered historically? That appears to be what one New Testament scholar is arguing. And we're going to take a look at what he says and why, and then I'm going to offer some interaction with his view. Do most people misunderstand how the Bible was inspired? That's what Dr. Mike Licona, an evangelical scholar, is arguing. I want to show a clip from his discussion that was hosted on Sean McDowell's channel. It was a discussion, maybe / debate with himself and Dr. John West, and they were debating the question of inerrancy and the inspiration of the New Testament, as they have differing perspectives on the topic of inerrancy. Are there errors in the Bible? And so they get into the question of, well, if there are potentially errors in the New Testament, does that then mean that the doctrine of divine inspiration is somehow impacted? Let's take a look at the clip, and I want to offer some interaction with it.
If we adopt the position that some of these statements are, I thirst, why have you forsaken me, etc., are not what Jesus said, and no one is saying he spoke them in English, but the best translations of what he said, so they're not changing it, they're changing it, not just translating it, then how do the words not lose their power? And I'll give you an example of this that I've thought about, Mike, is when I discovered in Chariots of Fire that Eric Liddell apparently didn't say, "When I run, I feel his pleasure." I was like profoundly disappointed. I was like, no, I quoted him. That has like authority from Eric Liddell. And so it kind of gutted me. And of course, that's not the same kind of authority, but that means something. So how do we preach out of this? How does it mean something? Do you qualify it and go, well, it was maybe made up, but it's still consistent with what Jesus said, as opposed to the way I hear people preaching, like, this is what Jesus said. Like, flesh out for me what that would look like.
Yeah. I think when you're talking about the person in the pew, you don't have to get into all these kinds of details.
So let me stop right there and offer some thoughts. To make sure we're all on the same page, what effectively is being asked here is, well, if you hold to the position that the Gospels sometimes have Jesus saying things that he didn't actually utter historically, such as in the Gospel of John, the I am sayings, I am the way, I am the vine, before Abraham was, I am. Those I am sayings that you can't find in any of the other Gospels, which is a difficulty because if he uttered these things historically, you would expect them to be in the other Gospels. Some scholars are going to argue that that might be evidence that he didn't say this historically, and so that John was just adding these things for rhetorical effect or for a theological purpose. That's what some scholars are maintaining, including Dr. Mike Licona. And so Sean McDowell is asking him, well, if the gospel authors take that kind of liberty, what are we supposed to do with people in the pew? And what does that do to preaching? Are we supposed to just say, by the way, Jesus didn't actually say this historically? How does that impact preaching? What are we supposed to say to people at the lay level in the pew? And Dr. Licona effectively says, well, we don't have to get into that with the average person in the pew. Now, I understand potentially the wisdom and not necessarily getting into the weeds and going through highly technical details and stuff that requires a great deal of skill and training to understand. I understand that, but I think this is something else. To say that we shouldn't tell people in the pew that Jesus didn't actually say this seems to me like we're hiding from people vital information. If that thesis is true, if Jesus didn't really say these things, and we just kind of go along with it as if he did, but we know he didn't, and we just don't tell the common people because we feel that it might ruin the sermon, or we don't want them to get lost in the weeds, to me it almost seems like that could be at the very least misconstrued as an attempt to hide truth from people, and potentially truth that would be very damaging to a lot of the apologetic claims that are out there today. Now, I'm not necessarily saying I agree with Dr. Mike Licona, and I'm not necessarily saying Jesus didn't say these things historically. All I'm saying is, if we take that position that he didn't say some of these I am sayings in the Gospel of John historically, and we know that to be the case, but we don't tell that to the average person in the pew, it seems to me like we're hiding something. And at the very least, this is something that could harm one's trust in leadership in the church. I mean, can you imagine if you're a layman who finds out that your pastor or your priest holds to this position, but they're deliberately withholding that information from you? You're going to feel like, wait, why were they lying to me? And what else are they hiding from me? What else do they know is not true, but they didn't tell me about?
You know, you gave the example of Chariots of Fire, great movie. Apollo 13, one of my favorites. Gene Kranz, who is played by Ed Harris, makes the famous statement, failure is not an option.
That's right.
But Gene Kranz never made that statement. I met, what was his, I don't remember his first name. I mentioned him in the book, Jesus Contradict. His last name is Grube, Grube. He was Gene's best friend, and he died within, I think, a week after I met with him at his house. And he told me, he said, he asked Gene, he said, I don't remember you even uttering that statement, because he was there at the time during Apollo 13. And Gene, he said, did you at some point utter that statement, failure's not an option? And Gene said, no, but I wished I had. But what had happened was the screenwriters, they took, after interviewing the people there, they took the spirit that these guys had, the attitude that they had, and they only had 2 hours to illustrate, to communicate what it was like with these guys. And the attitude, failure was not an option, was there. It was so crystal clear amongst all of these. And so they put it on the lips of Gene Kranz. So,
and I understand what Dr. Licona is saying here when it comes to movies. Sometimes they, with artistic license, take some freedoms and they'll make a character say something that they didn't actually say historically, but maybe it was in the atmosphere, maybe it was understood, maybe it was implicit. I get that. I'm not exactly sure that's the same thing as what is being done in the Gospels. I'm not exactly sure that maps onto the situation of, for example, the Gospel of John and potentially putting words on the lips of Jesus that he did not utter. I understand the idea is that, well, okay, maybe Jesus didn't say these things historically, but it was certainly there in his ministry in some kind of way. It was implied. It was the atmosphere. All right, I can see where one would try to make that connection, but I think there's some very serious difficulties here. Number one, if Jesus did not utter those things historically, if, for example, he did not say, I am that I am, if he did not claim, therefore, in John 8:58 to be divine, then that does a great deal of damage to the claim that Jesus is divine, because after all, it's usually in the Gospel of John with the I am sayings that we find this assertion that Jesus is divine. We don't tend to find them as clearly in the other Gospels. We have to look to the Gospel of John for that claim. And so if we're now weakening those claims by saying Jesus didn't actually say them historically, but maybe it was kind of implied, it was in the air, it was understood, that severely weakens the argument, especially when Jesus elsewhere explicitly says things that could be interpreted as negating his divinity, such as him saying he doesn't know the day or the hour, or him saying to the Father, you are the only true God. And it seems to me this argument also hinges on the assumption that we know the author of the Gospel of John was intending to put on the lips of Jesus something he didn't explicitly say, but maybe something that was just kind of understood and was in the atmosphere. How do we know that? How do we know the author of the Gospel of John wasn't reporting what he believed to be actual words of Jesus? If we say, well, because if Jesus actually said these things historically, they would have been recorded in the accounts of the other Gospels. I understand that line of reasoning. I understand that argument, but it doesn't automatically follow, therefore, that means John wasn't intending to give something that he believed to be a historical account of the words of Jesus. To assume that is something that we have to do by faith. And that's legitimate, that's fine. But for a skeptic who doesn't share that faith, they're not going to make that assumption. And they're going to say, the fact that the other Gospels don't record that doesn't necessarily mean that John wasn't trying to give a historical account of the words of Jesus. It more likely means that these Gospels are not giving accurate information, are perhaps contradicting themselves, or that John is making things up, or that John is misreporting things. So while I respect what Dr. Licona Licona is doing here in trying to salvage this approach and save this attempt to both accept the inspiration of the Gospel of John, but the negation of the claim that Jesus actually historically said some of these things. While I respect what he's trying to do, I think the only people who would be convinced of this are people who already hold that the Gospel of John is inspired and are just kind of looking for a way to make it work. I don't think that this would be something that would convince a non-believer who is sincerely seeking answers and is truly open to the claims of the Gospel of John. But on the other hand, I am sympathetic to Dr. Licona, because if that path is blocked, then there does remain a difficulty of explaining why the Gospel of John has Jesus making claims like this, but they're not recorded in the other Gospels. I mean, after all, if Jesus historically said, "I am that I am," and claimed to be Yahweh, you would expect that to be something that the other Gospels would have said. And so it does raise the question, why didn't the other Gospels say this? And there have been potential solutions that various people have attempted to offer, and perhaps we can explore those another time. But yes, it does raise a very difficult challenge that has to be accounted for.
Did Gene Kranz utter that? No. But was that attitude the attitude that they all had at Mission Control at that point, or Houston Control? Yes. So I think when you come to the Gospels, they do give us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. Do they take some liberties in the way they report things? Yes. John more than the others. This is something that Mike Licona did not come up with.
An additional challenge is, if they're taking these kinds of liberties, how can we really rely on them? How can we have confidence in them? And also, how do we know which are the areas that they took liberties in and which are the areas that are historically true? How do we know where they're just trying to make a theological and rhetorical point versus where they're actually recording something that Jesus really said? Where do we draw that line? How do we determine one from the other? I think that's a very serious difficulty for this position.
This is something that has been around since Origen and others, where they called John a spiritual gospel. They recognized that there was differences.
Yeah, so Origen is a really interesting one, because for him, he actually felt that there were contradictions in the Gospels. So he felt that where there were contradictions, at the very least, one of those Gospel accounts is not something that actually historically happened, but was rather an allegorical point. It was some kind of spiritual, theological point, not something that actually happened historically. And that's the way he attempted to harmonize what he perceived to be contradictions in the Gospels.
Johannine specialists recognize that there are differences. I look at John and I say, yeah, he's teaching the same thing, but he sure sounds a lot different than he does in the other Gospels.
Well, that's the thing right there. A lot of the non-believers are going to say he's not teaching the same thing in the Gospel of John as in other Gospels. And so if Jesus didn't really say these things in the Gospel of John, the fact that it's at odds with these other Gospels just goes to show that these are not reliable historical accounts of the ministry of Jesus. And that would weaken the claims of the Christian faith, not strengthen it in any kind of way. So for him to say that, well, he's teaching the same thing, how does he determine that? We need to find out the methodology, because again, I know just most non-believers are just going to say, I don't see it. I don't know how you arrived at that conclusion. If it's an appeal to faith, okay, fair enough. But again, non-believers don't share that faith. And so I think they're going to look for something a little bit more objective in nature.
So I'm trying to, how does the pastor communicate this? Again, I don't think that they have to get into details.
Well, again, I have to stress that's going to harm the credibility of leadership in the church if this is information that is being withheld from the people in the pew. It's going to harm confidence and trust. It's not going to build it. And I'll also add, it won't just harm confidence in leadership. It will harm confidence in the Bible itself, because then a person is going to ask, well, wait, if Jesus didn't say this, did Ezekiel say this? Did Daniel say this? Did Jeremiah say this? Did John the Baptist say this? They're going to ask those questions.
But maybe if they're giving some kind of classes there for people who are really interested in getting deep into it, they can do it. Let me just conclude this.
Yeah.
There are two principles that I teach my students when we talk about these things. Number one, our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. And number two, if we truly want to have a high view of Scripture, then we will accept it as God has given it to us, rather than attempting to force it to fit in a mold of how we think He should have. And if we neglect to do this, we may believe we have a high view of Scripture, but in reality, all we have is a high view of our view of Scripture. And that's just misplaced piety.
Okay, so in many ways, your view is what you call a bottom-up view, starting with an analysis of the text. So you start with that passage in Mark chapter 1. You start with a quote of Zechariah and Jeremiah, come to the conclusion that the authors at times change things. Maybe they got things that seem wrong on the surface, but they had some liberty to invent or change certain sayings, largely faithful to who Jesus was and what he taught. And that could be understood within inerrancy if we understand what the intentions of the writers were. Is that a fair summary
Yes.
of your position? Okay.
So to me, this just kind of comes across as just trying to make it work, forcing it, artificially contriving a system that harmonizes this together in a way that it technically checks out, but, it just doesn't seem very satisfying. And on the one hand, I totally understand an attempt to harmonize things that are in tension together. I get that. I mean, we often do that with the magisterium. We've discussed that a great deal on this channel, talked about difficulties in the magisterium and attempts to harmonize things and read them with a hermeneutic of continuity. And at the end of the day, a lot of people still feel that, hey, there's just no way to harmonize some of this stuff, like on the death penalty, for example, and some of the recent revisions of the church's position on that question and others. Some people feel like, hey, there's just no way to harmonize it. There's no way to make it work. And if that's the case with some tensions in the magisterium, how much more for other situations like this with the Gospels and gospel harmonizations? So I can sympathize with people who are trying to make this work, but I just don't know if this is really it. To me, I think people need to look for a different solution because I'm not entirely convinced that this one really works. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to put them in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button for plenty more content like this. We'll see you later. God bless. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/Reason and Theology.